The Kennedy administration was committed to integrating the South. Units of the 101st had already been used at Little Rock, and we remained the primary enforcer. When Governor George Wallace of Alabama proclaimed, "Segregation now, segregation forever," Task Force Cassidy, under the direct control of the President, was sent to Birmingham to prove he was dead wrong. From our task force headquarters at Fort McClellan, we began contingency planning in neighboring Mississippi and Georgia. The hatred of the time was incredible, and with blood spilling as passionately as it had during the Civil War, fears were high that all of Dixieland would soon be engulfed. One recon in Mississippi had me cruising in a Hertz rental car with 2 FBI agents, General Cassidy and Major Joe Wilson, Task Force G3. We played the average tourists as we drove around, picking out landing zones, radio and TV stations, and staging assembly and enclosure areas, the latter to wire in anyone who was arrested. But just like the reconnaissance picnics we'd taken in Germany, we didn't fool the rednecks for a minute. Our skinhead paratrooper haircuts, the FBI guys' short top, back and sides, and their identical black plastic sunglasses made us stick out like a sore thumb. I was the Task Force G4, responsible for keeping the troops fed, the vehicles maintained, and all other logistic considerations. Part of the job was to submit a daily logistics report to the Pentagon's Tactical Operations Center, TOC. One evening I made my usual call. "TOC, this is Task Force Cassidy. I've got the equipment status report for you." "Okay, give it to me," replied a young, brash voice that I disliked immediately. I made the report, and when I finished, the guy said very cuttingly, "Yesterday you had 400 vehicles. Today you have 399. You're missing a vehicle. Where is it?" Smart-ass whiz kid, I thought. I wouldn't have a clue. "It's no big thing," I replied. "We're still 100% operational. Probably a truck is down with a broken axle. Vehicles get sick, you know, just like people." "Don't get smart with me, soldier," he shot back. "Look," I said, "I don't have time for this. Do you want the report or don't you?" "Do you realize who you're talking to?" the guy roared through the line. "Yes, I'm talking to a wise-ass who's over-impressed with his own importance and who's got nothing better to do than mess with the troops. Let me speak to your commanding general." I suddenly realized I'd probably gone too far. "Well, who are you?" I asked. "I am Robert F. Kennedy. I'm the Attorney General. I'm commanding your organization. I'm responsible for handling civil disturbances, and if I want to know every last detail, soldier, you'll provide it. Now, get me your boss right now." "Talk about centralization." I put the phone down and went to see General Cassidy, whom by now I knew quite well, and vice versa. "General, you won't believe what I've done." "I'll believe it, hack," he said. "Just tell me." See, I thought he was some clerk at the Pentagon TOC giving us a hard time, but I just told the Attorney General of the United States that he was a wise-ass. Cassidy moaned. "Of all people, Hackworth, of all people," and headed for the phone in the Task Force TOC. It was just lucky for me that both men were Irish. Cassidy managed to convince Kennedy that it was the Irish in me that had started all the trouble, and the Attorney General accepted Cassidy's apology on my behalf. With that, the good general hung up the phone and left the TOC, shaking his head. "Of all people, Hackworth, of all people." General Cassidy was not quite so sympathetic the next time I got a little carried away in Alabama. On that occasion, the problem had actually begun at Fort Campbell when it occurred to me that Master Sergeant Holtman, my operations sergeant, was retiring in a few weeks. Holtman had been a fine teacher for me in my early G4 days. Besides that, he was a friend and a great soldier, and I wanted him to have something special to remember the army by. But he didn't want a parade, he didn't want anything, he said. Then, a few days short of his retirement, he changed his mind. What he wanted, he told me, was to go up with me in a helicopter full of parachutes, and for the two of us to keep jumping out of that chopper until all those chutes were gone. "It's done," I said. I was fortunate to have a few of my own out at that time, including both a helicopter pilot and a parachute maintenance officer. So the day before Holtman was to retire, as per his wish, I had a big stack of parachutes and our own personal chopper standing by. We flew around the Alabama countryside until we found a good drop zone in some farmer's field. With that, we put on our first chutes and jumped out. On the ground, we rolled up the chutes, threw them in a stack, got picked up by the chopper, and as the bird gained jump altitude, slipped into the next chutes so we could do it all over again. I don't know how many jumps we made, but I do know we were bone-weary by the time we'd finished. The body wasn't made for so many opening shocks in a row, but if an old paratrooper wanted to go out that way, who had the right to deny him? Few would disagree that paratroopers were an unusual breed of men. Some might say they were a little nuts. "Why would anyone jump out of an airplane?" went the rhetorical old saying. "The thing is flying along perfectly well, and there's a guy up front who can put it down on the ground for you, so why jump out of it?" But despite this leg sentiment, few could honestly argue that the paratroopers weren't the elite of the army, or that paratroop units were not filled with a cross-section of the best studs around. Slim Jim Gavin was right. When he said that if you want to find out if a guy will fight in battle, find out if he'll jump out of an airplane. If he will, you'll know he's a fighter. The average paratrooper was motivated, aggressive, and proud. Tough-fibred, hard-living, sometimes reckless, and even wild. Airborne was unique. There was the adrenaline rush of the jump itself, the butterflies in your stomach beforehand, the cold wind lashing your face as you stood in the door waiting for the green light, the merciless prop blast as you took the plunge, and then the falling, confident your chute would open but never sure until, thank God, the violent jerk that told you it had. Then you simply sailed, feeling pretty invincible, with your main concern a rendezvous with the DZ, drop zone, and not with trees, poles, or other hard, immovable objects on the ground. And then you landed. When it was over, everyone was smiling, laughing, happy. Airborne provided a unique sense of oneness among its ranks, from the lowliest private to a 2-star general. The shared danger of jumping out of a plane onto a hot or cold DZ had a levelling effect. When the mules failed on the drop zone during Swift Strike 3, for example, rank had no bearing as everyone pitched in to push them off. No one wanted to see even a single unnecessary casualty. The bonding effect of shared danger meant, too, that no one was unaffected when another man's exhilaration turned to terror. As in the story of the aircraft that ran into engine problems after it had dropped all its troopers, leaving the 2 static jump masters to decide whether to bail out over the DZ or limp back with the plane to its base in Ohio and go through the hassles of getting home. The jump masters chose to bail out with the aircraft's emergency chutes, and on the way down, one of them had a malfunction. When the man's body was recovered, it revealed that he'd clawed the whole way through his field jacket, his fatigue jacket, his T-shirt, and his own stomach, frantically searching for the D handle on the reserve chute. It was an ingrained thing. Main chute malfunctions. Pull the D-ring on your reserve over your belly. The problem was that the 2 jump masters had used Air Force chutes, which had no reserves. But for the grace of God, there go I, thought paratroopers all over the land. The other unique thing about the Airborne was its NCOs. Even the short, stocky ones looked lean and mean. Their faces were leathery, their bearing ramrod straight, and on jumps, most particularly, the jump masters had a cold and beady-eyed look that took years to master. I met the quintessential Airborne NCO at Campbell on a jump just before Task Force Cassidy. We had been standing up in the aircraft, hooked up and ready to go. But on the approach to the DZ, the wind velocity increased and the drop was aborted. We tried again, but the wind was even worse. The turbulence was knocking guys all over the aircraft. We had to throw our arms over the anchor cable just to keep upright. Next came the puking all over the troop compartment. Meanwhile, this jump master just stood there staring at us with those beady eyes, seemingly immune to it all. I was fascinated, especially when his grained face started to turn pale green, then olive drab, then jade. Then suddenly, like a snake striking out, the jump master pulled the front of his jacket open and threw up inside it. And without even a blink, he was back to staring at us with his old airborne sergeant eyes. To me, that said it all. The airborne NCO was just one tough hombre. Airborne was his life. He usually went from one airborne assignment to the next, be it from Fort Campbell, 101st, to Fort Bragg, 82nd, to Germany, 8th Div, to Okinawa, Hoona, 73rd, and back to Campbell or Bragg again. The attachment to airborne was certainly not for love of money. Jump pay was a big $55 a month, and at least twice that amount was spent monthly on tailoring and laundry costs alone. Every day in the airborne began in a freshly washed and starched pair of cut-down fatigues, and both officer and NCO broke starch, putting on a fresh pair once or even twice throughout the day. This was not to mention the non-issue but mandatory Corcoran jump boots, the cost of sewing patches, stripes and insignia onto all those uniforms, and the Silver Fund, Community Chest, Red Cross, Old Soldiers' Home, etc., etc. Handouts. Everybody and his brother wanted some come payday, with unit competitiveness spilling into the area of greatest contributions too. The NCOs were invariably set back in this area themselves, in the effort to set the example for their troops. No, the job was one of love alone for these old-time gunfighters, a dying breed. In the end, any price was insignificant for the honour of being airborne. By the time Holtman and I got back to Fort McClellan, it was getting dark. The mess was empty, and as the two of us sat there eating and bullshitting, a trooper from G4 rushed up to me, looking mighty worried. "General Cassidy wants to see you ASAP," he said. "What's the deal?" "I don't know, but whatever you did must be real bad. He is one pissed-off guy." Holtman came with me over to Cassidy's office and waited outside while I went in alone. "Hackworth," the general began, "I got a call this afternoon from Lieutenant General Truman, Commanding General of 3rd Army. He asked me if I had any paratroopers out jumping in a field in Alabama. I checked with my operations and determined that there weren't any, so I said no. Afterwards, to be on the safe side, I checked with the aviation officer to see if there were any aircraft out today. It turned out that one helicopter had been checked out to you. Now, would you like to enlighten me on what you've been doing today?" "No problem, sir. I've been out jumping." "You've been out jumping?" Cassidy repeated calmly, like the calm before the storm. "Without authority from me? Without authority from 3rd Army?" Now the general was red-faced and beginning to thunder. "Hackworth, you know who has to give permission for any parachute jump. You didn't de-energize the power in the area. You didn't have a medical jeep on the drop zone to take care of jump casualties. You didn't have a drop zone safety officer. You didn't have anything," he roared. "God damn it, Hackworth, you've violated every regulation in the book. Meanwhile, I told General Truman it couldn't have been anyone from my outfit. Now I have to go back and tell him I don't even know what's happening in my own command." "Hell, Hackworth," General Cassidy wound up his totally justified tirade. "I should sack your dumb ass." I had never seen General Cassidy's temper so aroused. I didn't say a word for fear of setting him off further. It didn't help. "Well, why'd you do it?" he blew up again. "Just explain to me why. I'm going to have to tell the general something." I said, "Sir, Master Sergeant Holtman wanted to go out this way. He retires tomorrow, and he wanted to make a few jumps rather than have a parade." "Holtman, huh?" said Cassidy. "So old Holtman's retiring, is he? Now that's a good man. Did you know we served together in World War II? "Yes, sir. He's in your outer office waiting to say goodbye." "Look, General, I know I really screwed up this time, no question about it. I should have followed regulations. I just didn't think we'd get caught. But wouldn't you have done the same thing for an old paratrooper?" "Okay, Hack," Cassidy admitted. "I would have done what you did, but a goddamn lot slicker. I wouldn't have found my ass in here at the end of the day. Now, how do you suggest I get out of it with Truman?" "Lieutenant General Lewis Truman, sir." "That's the one." "Easy, sir," I said. "You call him up and say you found out the problem. When he says what, you say it was Hackworth. He'll say, "Dave Hackworth?" You say, "Yeah, he was a company commander in your regiment in the 40th Division," and he'll understand. You tell him about Holtman, and tell him you're going to burn my arse, but not severely, so as not to ruin my record. Because I don't think he'd want my career ruined as a tool. If you served well with someone in combat, the bond established went on forever, and many an indiscretion could be overlooked. So Cassidy rang Truman and said, "Sir, it was Dave Hackworth," and that was the end of it. Of course, had Cassidy not been Cassidy, a real soldier from the old school, my career could well have ended that day. But since he was, and all was well that ended well, Holtman retired just the way he wanted to. When I thought about the incident afterward, all I knew was I wouldn't think twice about doing it all over again. Task Force Cassidy continued without interruption, reaching its zenith when 101st Troopers pulled George Wallace out of the front door of the University of Alabama, and a black student named Vivian Malone walked inside. With that, we went back to Fort Campbell. But there, the pace didn't slacken for even a minute. We were kept hopping, not just with the day-to-day workings of the G4 shop, but also with some tremendous upheaval in the division. There was a continuous turnover as more and more people got orders to the advisory effort in Vietnam. I still wanted to go, but for reasons I'd never know, the assignment was not forthcoming. G4, Colonel Abbott's, meanwhile, tried to take my mind off the situation by pushing me to attend Austin P. College in Clarksville, Tennessee, through an Army-sponsored bootstrap degree completion program. In a world where a second or third language and a master's degree were among the tickets to success, my bachelor's degree, or lack thereof, was becoming of crucial importance to my future. Without it, there was little chance I'd be selected for regular Army, and unless Vietnam broke open into an all-out war, no RA meant automatic retirement as a reserve major in 1968, at the tender age of 37. The idea of giving up the Army, my life, in my prime, was pretty hard to swallow. But after my University of Maryland degree fell through the cracks in Germany when the Berlin Wall went up, I'd lost heart for ever getting one. In G4 operations there was no time for going to class, much less for studying, so despite Colonel Abbott's insistence that I try again, I'd resigned myself to the fact that it couldn't be done. But Abbott's would not be swayed. He called a friend of his at OPO's infantry branch, and before long returned with the word that both DA and the 101st Chief of Staff, Colonel John T. Barry, had cleared the way for me to take time off from Army life to join the academic world. I half-heartedly submitted my paperwork and waited for the necessary rubber stamp that would finally lead to my degree. Then, in early November, Ngo Dinh Diem, who had governed South Vietnam since its creation in 1954, first as premier and then as president, was assassinated. Over the years, the once respected Diem had grown further and further away from the needs of his people, even as he insisted that he knew what was best for them. Despite the millions of dollars the United States provided in both economic and military aid, Diem, the head of a Catholic regime in a predominantly Buddhist culture, had paid only lip service to US-suggested reforms that might have eliminated the base cause of the ongoing war of liberation in his country. Assassinated with the president was his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, a power-hungry mandarin who, along with his wife, the much-hated Madame Nhu, had actually run the country in recent years, as the weak, ineffective Diem retreated into personal isolation in the face of the escalating crisis in Vietnam. While history would suggest that the United States had instigated or at least condoned the coup that led to the NGO brothers' deaths, whatever the circumstances, the joy that greeted the news in many quarters of South Vietnam signalled that one way or another, perhaps it had been meant to be. 21 days later came the death of another head of state, but this one shocked the world. I was sitting in a dentist's chair at Fort Campbell. 12,000 shots of Novocaine couldn't have numbed me more than the news flashed on the radio that John F. Kennedy was dead. At first I thought it was some Orson Welles hoax. To me, JFK was an invincible comrade in arms. I felt we had shared combat somehow in Berlin, and then again during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Both times the US had emerged victorious, and it was Kennedy who'd given me those proud moments of my life. So when I found out it was true, that he was dead, the pain was as deep as that of losing a close friend on the battlefield. Meanwhile, US military units around the world went on full alert should the Soviets take America's grief as a sign of vulnerability and launch some kind of preemptive strike. They didn't, of course, and though communist sympathizer Lee Harvey Oswald was captured and charged with Kennedy's assassination, his live-on primetime death at the hands of Jack Ruby meant the facts of the case, as in the death of Diem, would never be fully known. In any case, November 1963 marked the end of an era in both Vietnam and America. The violent deaths of their leaders set both countries careening toward each other like runaway trains before hardly anyone, certainly not the American people or even Lyndon Johnson, the new president himself, even knew they had jumped the tracks. When Colonel Abbots received his own orders for an advisory assignment in Vietnam, I assumed it was all over for my bootstrap degree. The thing was that while the 101st's Chief of Staff had approved my going to school, he would not give the G4 shop a replacement major. None were available. During my absence, Colonel Abbots had accepted this, but I doubted his successor would. To expect a new boss to go short-handed in our extremely busy staff section for almost a year was really too much to hope for. So in early December, when Lieutenant Colonel John Neff, the new G4, called me in to say I was off to Austin Peay, I was knocked out. A replacement still had not been found for me, but Neff, an urbane, thoughtful West Point officer, seemed unconcerned. Somehow everyone would manage, he said, and it was important for me to get the degree. I was amazed. In a more often than not self-serving army world, Neff, who had every right to cancel my orders, was thinking of me. Despite its belly-to-belly proximity to Fort Campbell, at Austin Peay College a sense of urgency was looked upon as some kind of dreaded Yankee disease. It was a big switch. Almost twice the age of many of my classmates, and 1,000 times more serious, I needed some time to settle into the peaceful and relaxed style of this sleepy southern school. Once I tuned out the 101st's hectic goings-on, though, I began to enjoy my TDY civilian life. I loved the people, maybe because the Hackworth family roots were anchored deep in the hills of Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. I enjoyed the academic side, too, and drove myself hard, majoring in history with minors in sociology and journalism based on interest and what seemed to be most applicable to being an army officer. Patty, the girls, and I still lived on post at Campbell, but if my temporary break from the pressures of G4 work had lifted the family's expectations for a more complete home life, they were soon dashed. I drove off to school in the morning, and when I came home, I locked myself in my study and hit the books until bedtime. I knew this was my last chance if I was going to make it in the army. Historically, the only thing Austin Peay had going for it was that Woodrow Wilson's father had taught there when the place was Southwestern Presbyterian University. When that school relocated to Memphis, Austin Peay, the governor of Tennessee and a Clarksville boy himself, had headed the push to bring another college to the town, and my soon-to-be alma mater was the result. Academically, Austin Peay had more in its favour. Many fine professors, for one thing. Among them was Dr. William Morris, who in particular opened a lot of doors in my head, including some I probably would have preferred to remain shut. Until a few months passed, and I started to loosen up and listen to other people's points of view. No doubt Morris considered me his resident Nazi stormtrooper student. I was as hardline as anyone could be, and in that, Morris and many of the other academics at Austin Peay were vehemently against America's creeping involvement in Vietnam. I often had to bite my tongue and force myself not to jump up and defend what we were doing. To me, although I disagreed with the advisory effort as it was being carried out, i.e. using it simply as a combat training ground for our inexperienced young officers, or so it appeared from my point of view as one who desperately wanted to go and was again and again refused, I truly believed we were right to help the South Vietnamese. It was as good a place as any to take a stand against the communists who were behind the Viet Cong. I was an avowed and enthusiastic proponent of the better to fight them in Southeast Asia than on the beaches of Santa Monica philosophy. And besides, wasn't that what America was all about? To help the poor and downtrodden, to help preserve freedom for those who couldn't do it alone. Over time, one of the things I liked most about being in school full-time was the chance to talk with civilians about the world out there and find out what the civilians out there thought. One of the strangest things I heard was over a Monday morning cup of coffee with a friend who was a light colonel's wife and a Radcliffe graduate getting her MA at Austin Peay. I had just finished telling her a story about a jump I'd recently made in which a quarter-ton Jeep was parked right in the middle of the DZ where I was about to land. The only thing that saved me from crashing into it was the Lieutenant DZ safety officer who'd parked it there in the first place. As luck would have it, I flew close enough to the guy on my way down to grab him and use him as a mattress. As I explained to this woman, there was no great satisfaction in creaming the safety officer into the side of his Jeep, but at least he learned a little lesson about parking vehicles on a drop zone. "You Scorpios are all the same," she responded. "You always go for the jugular." The comment seemed like the biggest load of crap I'd ever heard. That was not to say my friend was wrong about me. It was just that I was not about to accept her amateur astrological analysis of my character. In the vanguards, I'd been fond of saying over a glass of beer that men fell into 3 categories: lovers, fighters, and killers. And I'd always prided myself on being a killer. The categories had nothing to do with the battlefield, or for that matter, with loving, fighting, or killing. Instead, they were my ways of describing how a guy looked at life. And while the categories were very distinct, they weren't mutually exclusive. You could start out as a lover and work your way up to a killer, and still not lose any of the apparently more positive aspects of the less lethal categories. A killer was really just a lover and a fighter who would use any method to get what he wanted, and was willing to risk it all in the attempt. A killer had to win. Killers did go for the jugular. They were the ones who lashed out, in my friend's terms, with a Scorpio sting. And although I dismissed what she said when she said it, I never forgot what that Radcliffe lady said. And when, over time, I discovered that 4 of the great generals of World War II, Patton, Montgomery, de Gaulle, and Rommel, were all Scorpios, I came to add to my Why I Am a Warrior list this accident of my birth. On the 2nd and 4th of August 1964, North Vietnamese patrol boats attacked 2 US destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, 30 miles off the coast of North Vietnam. I was outraged. So was Professor Morris. The 4th of August episode prompted President Johnson to order US air attacks on mainland North Vietnamese military installations, the first use of overt American force in the conflict. And while all I hoped was he'd flatten the whole goddamn communist country, Professor Morris said the whole thing was an election year sham. He compared the Tonkin Gulf incidents to Hitler's Canary just prior to invading Poland, and said that LBJ's "We Seek No Wider War" proclamation was a lie of the first order, and that the exercise had been orchestrated to give the president the popular support of the American people. A Harris poll conducted soon after the US Tonkin Gulf reprisal proved Morris right on at least one count. The nation's approval rating of LBJ's handling of the Vietnam War soared from a pre-Tonkin 42% to 72%. And while history has proved him right on the other counts too, at the time I felt as if I were sitting face to face with Benedict Arnold. Couldn't Morris see that the North Vietnamese, not the United States, had been the aggressor at Tonkin, thought I, and such acts had to be dealt with? But the professor just raged on, much in the spirit of Oregon Senator Wayne Morse, who was simultaneously raging in the Senate that we are going to be bogged down in Southeast Asia for years to come if we follow this course of action, and we are going to kill thousands of American boys, until finally the American people are going to say what the French people finally said: we've had enough. Coming as I did from the viewpoint of a soldier in the world's best army, I quietly disagreed with Morris's and Morse's assessments. But as I was just a few weeks shy of finals and then graduation, I just bit my tongue again and kept silent. But there would be no finals for me at Austin Peay. Graduation, yes, with a BS I could not have been prouder of, but finals, no. When Dr. Bowman, the college's dean, assented to DA's request that my exams be waived so I could attend the Army's Command and General Staff College, CGSC, at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, it was a big surprise. I had never even put CGSC on my wish list. That particular school was a significant stepping stone in the army, and only 50% of the officers eligible to attend got the nod. Selection meant a light colonel, no sweat, and I was thrilled. As if that, and not having to take finals, weren't enough, I found out that after my tour at Leavenworth, I'd been reassigned to the 101st Airborne, giving me my third troop duty assignment in a row. Somebody was definitely looking after me. CGSC was a gentleman's course, 99.9% in the classroom and only 5 or 6 hours a day. There was a fair amount of homework involved, but fresh out of college I was used to studying, and I found the whole thing a snap. The instruction duplicated much of what I'd learned at the career course at Benning. It seemed to me that students would have been better served had Benning concentrated on tactics and troop-leading procedures taught in the field and command, despite its name, on staff procedures, which were taught damn well there, and related paper-shuffling techniques. I never believed you could teach command anyway. Sure, you could sit a guy down and teach him the principles of it, but command itself came from experience, from on-the-job training under solid vets, and from doing it yourself. The mismatch of Warrior and Clark instruction could well have been at the root of the initial misunderstanding between my class's airborne students and the CGSC school commandant, Major General Harry J. Lemley, Jr. Soon after we arrived, an edict came down from the commandant's office stating that no student could wear jump boots, berets, or airborne overseas caps to class. The airborne guys were most pissed off. It was an outrageous policy emanating from clerks at the top, who didn't understand what made any gung-ho soldier tick. Still, we grudgingly followed the order until our Alabama airborne classmate, Lee M., stood in the door. Lee M., a 3rd Division Medal of Honor winner from the Korean War, now on TDY at Leavenworth from the Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg, was a friend from my Germany days. He'd served in Ted Max's 505th Battle Group, and I'd met him when the Vanguards invited the officers of the 8th Division Rifle Team, of which Lee was a member, to one of our Friday night beer calls. Unit rivalry between hosts and guests had run at a fevered pitch throughout that rowdy evening, and before it was over, Colonel Johns's personalized beer stein had disappeared. Happily, the thievery occurred early enough for significant retaliation. I knocked off all the 55th guys' fatigue caps, which were hanging on a hat rack outside the club, and took them home with me. The next day, I received a frantic pre-reveille call from short and feisty Lee M. His Master Blaster blood wings were on his hat, and he desperately wanted them back. I told him the wings were being held hostage. The ransom, Colonel Johns's beer stein. Lee M. readily agreed, and the swap was soon made. But that incident was the only time I ever saw a fine fighter like Lee M. not 100% on top of things at Leavenworth. As far as he was concerned, the situation was simple. No way was he going to let anyone see him without his beret or jump boots on. "As well go on back to Bragg," he said. "I'm a paratrooper first, not some chicken crap schoolboy." Since it wouldn't have looked too good for the commandant of CGSC to have a Blue Max winner quit his school, Lemley quickly backed down, and soon we paratrooper students went back to dressing airborne all the way. The 3 big areas of conversation outside CGSC classrooms were the 1964 elections, the expanding Vietnam commitment, and ticket punching. Ticket punching was by now a concept set in concrete. Everyone from brand-new West Point second lieutenants on up talked about the punches they had or had to get. I'd often been amazed by the stuff coming out of the West Point-educated junior officers' mouths. Most of them worried and war-gamed their punches as if their entire academy experience had been programmed to get stars some 20 years down the track. Never mind becoming a competent leader of men today. Now there were actually ticket-punching formulas discussed openly at CGSC. A master's degree punch, for example, plus a DA staff punch, plus a battalion command punch, equaled assignment to War College. A War College punch equaled a star. A combat punch was considered essential, and everyone wanted to get his as a counterinsurgency advisor in Vietnam. Not a whole lot of regulars wanted command of US troops if there was any way to avoid it. Troop duty was where you got burned. There were too many booby traps, too many things to go wrong in the one-strike-you're-out, zero-defect army of the early 60s. The prevailing attitude was that it was much safer to be at a staff-swollen HQ where a mistake could be shunted off to bureaucratic Never-Never Land, and no one was responsible. Meanwhile, dumbass that I was, all I wanted was to be with troops, and I couldn't wait to get back to Fort Campbell, where I was ready to beg, borrow, or steal to get down with the soldiers again. The presidential election was fast approaching. Most of my classmates were Goldwater fans. None dared call it treason. A book that accused the Democrats of being soft on communism was making the rounds throughout the class, and the general feeling was that Goldwater, an avowed hawk, would take care of communist North Vietnam one way or another, even proposing nukes to get the job done. Goldwater promised to get us into a war, and Johnson promised peace. Little did anyone know that a vote for LBJ would get the country everything Goldwater had promised. It would be my first real lesson in politics. Vietnam was quickly closing in on US forces, both in the war-torn country itself and at home. Well over 100 American lives had been lost there so far. The US was spending $1.5 million every day, with the only significant result being the Viet Cong growing bolder. In November, 3 months after the Tonkin Gulf incidents, the VC attacked the US airfield at Bien Hoa, killing 4 American soldiers and destroying an entire B-57 squadron, $10 million worth of airplanes. Maxwell D. Taylor, who had been President Kennedy's special representative and had visited Vietnam in 1961, concluded that there was no military means of defeating the VC in the near future. In 1964, now as U.S. ambassador to South Vietnam, he was pushing for escalation. His 1961 belief that a coordinated military and political program under American guidance could settle Vietnam's problems in a few years had been dashed. Since Diem's death, during which time U.S. support had been received only by an increasingly unstable, coup-plagued country whose leaders agreed on nothing and paid scant attention to American wishes anyway, the ray of hope in the first quarter of 1963, when U.S. intelligence estimated communist defections to South Vietnam had doubled, was dim. With Taylor home from Vietnam observing that the ability of the Viet Cong continuously to rebuild their units and to make good their losses was one of the mysteries of this guerrilla war, the situation seemed increasingly grim. Meanwhile, the South Vietnamese army was growing weaker by the day, as untrained units were being thrown into the breach. Division advisor Lieutenant Colonel John Paul Van, who a dozen years before had welcomed me to the 8th Ranger Company in Korea, warned in 1963 that unless the Viets started fighting better themselves, chances were the Americans would find themselves even more involved in the struggle for Southeast Asia. The Viets weren't fighting any better in late 1964, and the many head-shaking Vietnamese officers, many of whom understood and spoke English only marginally, indicated that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. I saw scurrying down CGSC corridors as guests of the US Army did little to give the lie to Van's belief. All in all, CGSC was an uninspiring period, but it was a vital punch on my ticket and augured well for my future, so I wasn't going to complain. I had to admit I was damn proud to be there. The day I was called to General Lemley's office to find Joe Cleland, the great White Father himself, waiting to see me was a highlight. The 11 years since we'd last met had been kind to him. His rosy cheeks, snow-white hair, and lean, mean paratrooper shape were all intact. His command style was as sharp as ever. He was just passing through Leavenworth, had heard I was there, and wanted to see how I was coming along. I was happy to tell him I'd recently been selected for regular army, particularly since, without him, I probably would have still been selling insurance. General Cleland was thrilled, especially when I told him I'd accepted only on the condition that I be commissioned into infantry. Few others would have understood, as Cleland did, why if I couldn't belong to the Queen of Battle, I wouldn't want to belong at all. By the time I returned to Fort Campbell, Rad had been introduced to the division, and Colonel Barry, the straight-shooting Chief of Staff, another good, solid soldier who should have gotten a couple of stars and ended up with none, assigned me to the newly designated 1st Brigade, 101st Airborne, 101. I wasn't with troops yet, but at least I was getting close. The brigade CO was Colonel James S. Timothy, a West Point DSC winner from his World War II European combat days. He had all the right punches: company and battalion command duty, a master's, War College DA, and joint staff duty, and was well on his way to his first star. Thoughtful, cool, considerate, and polished, Jim, as he was known, though we called him Tim behind his back, was a fine, articulate, and knowledgeable man. The best way to describe him was as James Mason in fatigues. His only real failing was an insistence on wearing his contact lenses when we jumped, one of which he'd invariably lose when he hit the ground, resulting in a mad search of the DZ. Colonel Timothy made me his brigade operations officer. Brigade headquarters was located in the old 327th Battle Group HQ, and since most of the brigade HQ staff were from the 327th, I was fortunate to have inherited a well-oiled S3 team whose years of experience working together had boiled the whole drill down to SOPs. My Sergeant Major, for example, Grady Jones, besides having a recent tour as an advisor in Vietnam under his belt, knew more about the paper side of the S3 job than I'd ever known existed. He and his solid and dedicated right-hand man, Master Sergeant Billy Sullivan, could run things with their eyes closed. My principal assistants, Captains Henrik Hank Lund, Operations and Plans, Phil Stein, Chemical, Richard Meyer, Communications, and Second Lieutenant Joel Stevenson, Training, were equally adept. My Army Diet Superior, Brigade XO Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Rogers, gave us a free hand to get the job done. Rogers, whose favourite expression was, "It's nice to have studs to hold back by the belt instead of guys who need to be booted in the arse," was a joy to work for. The only pain he ever caused me was when we jumped together on manoeuvres. He was a master jumper, but even I hurt when he hit the ground. Rather than doing a PLF, he kind of thumped down on his side like a bag of potatoes falling off the back of a truck. S3 was a 7-day-a-week job, with weekdays requiring a minimum of 12 to 16 hours each. Though I was working in a different capacity, the requirements at brigade were the same as they'd been on the division level. Desert training exercises, division-ready force commitments, which tied up 1 battalion minimum every 3rd week, and myriads of other drills that had the unit hopping all over the world. The overcommitment was wild. Fortunately, civil disturbance commitments had slacked off, but the parades, inspections, and normal ash and trash of peacetime soldiering, not to mention the mandatory participation in the individual pet projects of DA, Continental Army Command, CONARC, 3rd Army, SD 8 Airborne Corps and Division, plus parachute operations and contingency missions, meant everything else was just dropped. There was barely enough time to sleep, much less to concentrate on the basic essentials of soldiering. This was no exaggeration. At about this time, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Hank Emerson, the G3 of our similarly overcommitted sister division, the 82nd, did a study which concluded that to actually fulfill all the training requirements laid on us by all levels of command would necessitate, in real terms, 450 training days per year. So like the guy who spends more than he makes each day, we got further and further behind. Among the worst drains on individual and small unit training time were General Paul D. Adams's Strategic Army Command, STRAC, Requirements and Command Material Maintenance Inspections, CMMI. In the case of the former, the most positive thing to come out of it was the addition of a new adjective to Army jargon. STRAC Trooper, or STRAC Unit, referred to military perfection. STRAC Requirements, on the other hand, or Stupid Troopers running around in circles, as the men themselves translated the acronym, were just more of the same tests to see how fast we could load up, and moved out. The Command Material Maintenance Inspection, CMMI, on the other hand, was a perfect example in action of the zero-defect syndrome of the 60s Army. Designed as spot checks to ensure all equipment was in working order, the CMI program, in the words of Hank Emerson, was a spectre that lazy guys in the logistics business used as a crutch to keep all the equipment properly prepared. This led to people just parking their vehicles in the motor pool and not using them for fear of being gigged for some minor malfunction. Emerson, who would become one of the great captains of the Vietnam War, also had strong words about the large-scale unit exercises that cut deeply into individual training. His pet peeve was the swift strike maneuvers, a total waste of soldiers' time after the initial jump and a 2-week exercise. Emerson believed the emphasis on large-scale maneuvers was due to the fact that the men in charge were the ones who had gotten to be lieutenant colonels overnight in World War II and had never had much experience at the platoon and company levels. I agreed. The purpose of the big maneuvers, which was principally to test staff and communications procedures, could have been met through command post exercises, CPX, that required little more than a few guys with radios and almost none of the taxpayers' money. But the men in charge, who'd been big unit movers from the early days of their careers, still saw themselves as big unit movers now. These exercises gave them their only chance to play with all their toys and boys. What they didn't recognize, however, because they'd never spent much time at platoon or company level, was that their big units were made up of small units and individual soldiers whose training needs had to be met, not just for the soldiers' own survival, which big unit movers didn't concern themselves with anyway, but for the ultimate success of the big unit maneuvers. This lack of recognition on the part of senior leaders did not bode well for the future. The only time any emphasis was placed on squad and platoon training was when we were expecting visitors, said Platoon Sergeant Robert Press of the 327 Battalion, who'd served in the 40th Division in Korea at the same time I did. Everything else seemed to have priority. Every day, it seemed, we were in the middle of or preparing for some sort of maintenance inspection, motor stables, maintenance of weapons, AAG inspections to determine if everyone had a shaving brush never used, and 3 sets of underwear. In all my years with the 101 as a platoon sergeant, I can only remember running my outfit through live fire exercises 4 or 5 times. Add on once a year on the range, and that was about it for live firing. But nothing seemed to interfere with the big operations. Barracks locked up, and all of us going out to sit in some defensive position for a day or so at a time. Sergeant Press was one who'd know. The nucleus of the brigade's NCOs came from the old 327th Paratroop Battle Group, and Press had been with the unit almost since its reactivation in 1956. Others, like First Sergeant Leo B. Smith and Master Sergeant John Humphrey, had been together for more than a decade. This group had fought in Korea as part of the 187th Regimental Combat Team, which was redesignated the 327th in 1956. Pound for pound, there was no doubt that the 1st Brigade's NCOs were the best I'd ever seen. Most were like Sweeney, dedicated professionals without an ounce of pretension, who started with the troops at 0500, revelled in their work, and worked long, uncomplaining days. The brigades and divisions' young officers were also the best of the best. Most were regular army, and dozens were the sons of generals. Most of the platoon leaders were West Pointers or ROTC distinguished military graduates who had augmented their basic training with Benning's airborne and ranger courses. If you added to this collection of stud officers and NCOs the tough, resourceful, highly motivated troops they led, a vast percentage of whom were black or Hispanic, you had the makings of one hell of a fighting team. But what concerned me when I got to brigade was that having the makings was not necessarily the same as having the goods. Because the brigade had such stellar personnel, and because we accomplished well the myriad big-picture tasks and requirements assigned to us, the overall impression we gave was that we were combat-ready, unproved but also unchallenged. This belief filtered all the way up the chain of command. We were like the best-looking, best-equipped track team in town, so studly and intimidating that even the coach didn't bother to fire the starter's gun to see if we could run. I knew how little time was devoted to individual and small unit training. My cursory review from Division and Swift Strike 3 the year before had told me that the individual battle groups, now battalions, were not nearly as sharply trained as they should have been. The fact that the 1st Brigade's S3 training officer was only a 2nd lieutenant, and this was true of every brigade in the division at this time, spoke volumes about the division's overall complacent attitude toward this vital component in preparing a combat-ready force. So now that I was at brigade level, I thought it was essential that we find out what our unit's strengths and limitations really were, so we could build from there. To this end, Colonel Timothy approved a tough, realistic operational readiness test, ORT, for each of the brigade's 3 battalions. The ORTs were similar to the ATTs we'd had in Germany, only not quite as long or as demanding. After all 3 battalions had been tested, the above-the-rest one, 327 commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Wilson, the second-to-none 2, 327 skippered by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Collins, and the 2502 Strike Force led by Lieutenant Colonel Wilfred Smith. One thing was clear. Had any of our war scenarios been the real thing, we would have had a lot of dead paratroopers on our hands. From Company HQ and up, all units functioned well. They produced clear, timely reports, and the staffs performed brilliantly. Below Company HQ, though, at the fighting level, the units performed very badly. In 2 of the 3 battalions, it wasn't that the troopers weren't gung-ho. They wanted to be good and thought they were good, but the fact was they just didn't have what it took. The depth of the problem was one of the more unexpected shocks of my life. These soldiers of the illustrious Screaming Eagles, who could jump out of airplanes and strut on a parade field as chrome-plated perfect troopers, who had the bearing, spirit and physical fitness of prize fighters, wouldn't have lasted a minute in the ring. They were almost ignorant when it came to the basics, all the John stuff. Fire and manoeuvre, hit the deck and roll, the stuff that keeps you alive had little meaning for them. It was a great relief to find that at least one of the battalions, the 327, was in damn good shape. Besides reflecting well on its commander, Jim Wilson, the 327's fine ORT result spoke eloquently for the unusual continuity of strong command that battalion had recently seen. Wilson, himself a wolfhound from Korea and a battlefield commission recipient, had inherited the unit from Colonel Herbert E. Wolfe, a World War II draftee who'd won a Silver Star as a PFC, was battlefield commissioned during the Luzon campaign in the Philippines, and came up through the ranks to retire as a Major General. Wolfe had taken the unit from Colonel William A., who'd coined the above the rest unit motto, and had been a tough training commander from as far back as his World War II 327 days. In any event, after the ORT, I was totally convinced that if the 1st Brigade was committed to anything more than a parade, we'd be shot down in flames. It would be Casino Pass or Korea, June-September 1950, all over again. I was equally convinced that the deteriorating situation in Vietnam would soon require US troops. The South Vietnamese were not holding their own at all. 3 days after I joined the brigade, on Christmas Eve 1964, the VC smuggled a 100-pound bomb into a 6-story building in downtown Saigon that just happened to be the largest US bachelor officers' quarters there, killing 2 Americans and 1 Australian, wounding 85 more Americans and Vietnamese, and demolishing the entire BOQ itself. There was little question that the harder the VC pushed, the more likely the Johnson administration would be to commit troops. And with longtime paratrooper Lieutenant General William Child Westmoreland now in charge as recently appointed commander of U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV, there was equally little question that the troops would be airborne, and very likely the 101st itself, which Westy had commanded from 1958 to 60. So we had to get cracking if we were going to be up for the big game. The more sweat on the training field, the less blood on the battlefield, read the shingle that hung on the wall behind my S3 desk. From the moment I put it there, I made the 101's combat readiness my personal mission. First came my training policy paper, written with the total support of Colonel Timothy. Results of our battalion's ORTs, I wrote in the opening statement, not exactly endearing me to the battalion commanders to whom it was addressed, have shown that our battalions are combat ready insofar as the commanders, staff and senior NCOs are concerned. The people who are not combat ready are the ones who must do the fighting. All leaders in this brigade have failed in their responsibilities to train the individual soldiers. Of course, Colonel Timothy, who appreciated good small unit training, having had 2 full years of it with the 79th Infantry Division prior to its landing at Normandy, couldn't go to his general and say, "I just tested my 3 battalions and they're not combat ready." In the zero-defect stakes, it would have been suicide for his own career. So instead, with Timothy's backing bit by bit, block of instruction by block, I took over the training of 1st Brigade myself to make it more realistic and more worthwhile, to instill in the men the right way of doing things as well as the killer instinct, the will to win. We slowly worked toward giving the unit a jungle rather than a desert orientation. We changed the umpire system too, from a combat power orientation to a tactical ability one. No longer was the winner the one who got the most troops, weapons and firepower on an objective the fastest, but the one who proved skillful in the basics, that is, proper tactical procedures en route to the objective. I found one West Point-trained platoon leader, for example, attacking a dug-in enemy across a pool table flat field. I chewed his ass, only then realizing he really didn't know any better. He'd had a lot of book learning thrown at him, but little hands-on training to experience how to do it the right way. His NCOs were as good as the brigade had, but they did what the lieutenant told them and didn't argue. So I made the guy do it again. I made him call for simulated supporting fires this time, to ingrain a habit that would save his and his unit's asses 1,000,000 times on the battlefield. I had his troops use fire and manoeuvre and concealed avenues of approach. Then I made him do it again and again. He learned, but it shouldn't have been my job to teach him. Why hadn't his company commander or his battalion commander shown him the right way? The problem was that these guys were so busy juggling commitments that they didn't have time. Some probably didn't know the basics themselves. But it was the preoccupation with potential failure, coming up short on a CMMI, blowing it on an ORT, not getting out on time in a division ready force alert, that put blinders on many an officer to the needs of his subordinates. The rigidity of the system brought out the worst in the ambitious, aggressive airborne personality of the early 60s, leading all too many officers to forget that their primary responsibility was to their troops and not to the grand laying of long careers. The problem was exacerbated by the widespread belief that assignment to the 101st was reserved for the Army's studs. Because of this, fine but inexperienced platoon leaders were loath to even ask the right questions, much less to fail. One excellent example was 2nd Lieutenant Pat Graves, who joined 1st Brigade after a stint with the 506. "I didn't get any guidance," he said. "I guess I was supposed to be the epitome of the Army officer as a 2nd lieutenant because I graduated from West Point. But quite frankly, I didn't know what the hell I was doing among the real hotshot airborne types in the 1st Brigade." Among the real hotshot airborne types was Captain Frederick Garide Terry Jr. Terry came from a long line of military men, descendant of both the Sharps and the Bennetts, and by marriage Ulysses S. Grant. His father had been killed on Saipan in 1944, and his grandfather, John Bennington Bennett, just 2 weeks earlier in Burma. Young Terry himself was a West Point class of 60-star lacrosse player, fresh from a couple of Special Forces tours in Laos and Vietnam, followed by chopper school, and now the 101st. He really was a stud of a soldier. But from the moment I laid eyes on him, I decided he was an overconfident, eager beaver ticket puncher. Nothing more, nothing less. Sure, he had the credentials, but to me, he was just another guy who knew a little about a lot and not much about anything. Fresh from flight school, when he took over the 1st Brigade's aviation section, which worked directly for me, I didn't trust him at all. I continued to depend on the lieutenant who had been the aviation officer until Terry's arrival. He had gotten us through all sorts of difficulties and was both a fine pilot and a solid aviation commander. One day around lunchtime, I received a call from the division. "Your aviation section will have a core ORT in 2 hours. The whistle had blown. The minute I picked up the phone, in exactly 2 hours, every aircraft in the section, all supplies, all records and so forth, had to be configured and ready to fly off into the afternoon sun. I called Captain Terry's quarters, only to be told he was out playing golf. I hated military men who played golf, not unlike I hated guys who made a point of socializing with their superiors at the officers' club. I had actually resigned from the officers' club at Fort Campbell and had to report to General Kritz and explain why. To me, it just had nothing to do with being a soldier, so this was just one more mark against young Terry. I immediately called the aviation lieutenant, gave him the job of organizing the ORT, and alerted Colonel Timothy, who would have paid the highest price of anyone should the test not go smoothly. As it turned out, the ORT went fine. The aviation section passed with flying colours. That was the end of it until about half an hour later, when this 6-foot-tall captain came storming into my office, fresh from the golf course and in a rage. "Major Hackworth," Terry said, "I don't like the way you handled the ORT." "That's the way the ball bounces, Terry," I replied. "I wanted to be sure we passed the test, and you were out playing golf with the CG, I presume. What did you want me to do, send one of my men out to chauffeur you and your little golf cart back to where you should have been? For openers, if you weren't so busy playing the social circuit, Terry, you might have had your sweet ass where it belonged, and that is in the brigade aviation section." "That's how you feel, Major?" "That's how I feel, Captain." "Then all I can say is I'm sorry. I'm only a captain." It wasn't exactly a subtle challenge. I stood up. "Okay, have a swing." Terry didn't need a second invitation. He took his swing and we went at it. He was one pissed-off hombre, and by the time we finished, the only thing more bruised and battered than the two of us was my cubicle of an office, which had not been exactly the best place to duke it out. So we just sat on the floor, both of us bleeding and panting, until Terry asked, "Are you going to report me?" "No," I said. "I didn't like you. I thought you were a ticket puncher and a phony, and I didn't go out of my way to find you for the inspection. You came to me and you were pissed off. You were right, so it's over. We understand each other." And we did. That fight was actually the beginning of a close friendship between Fred Terry and me. Only then did it occur to me that I'd probably just been jealous of this guy for being such a complete stud with everything, including heritage. Over time, I realized he was only doing what was necessary to advance his career. I realized, too, that I had no right to be so quick to judge in the first place. I coveted those CG's bachelor's degree and general staff punches on my ticket as much as the next guy. In the name of my career, I'd already found myself wargaming how and when I'd be able to get a master's degree too. In January 1965, US estimates counted 40,000 full-time Viet Cong guerrillas in South Vietnam, and up to 40,000 if the part-time VC, who doubled as civilian farmers, were added to the tally. Despite this enemy, and with more than 30,000 US advisory and support people in-country to assist, the poorly trained South Vietnamese were losing a battalion a week. Time was not on our Southeast Asian friends' side. The Americans, too, were taking their share of lumps. In February, during Tet, the Vietnamese New Year, the Viet Cong attacked Camp Holloway, a US helicopter base in 2nd Corps at Pleiku. The casualties were 7 Americans killed in action, KIA, and 109 wounded, with 6 choppers destroyed and 17 other aircraft severely damaged. The Johnson administration retaliated with a 49-aircraft air raid on the North Vietnamese town of Dong Hoi, where South Vietnamese communist cadres were known to be trained and housed. The following week, 21 Americans were killed when Viet Cong guerrillas destroyed the US advisor barracks at Quin Hon. The tit-for-tat continued when, in response, 160 planes took off for a bombing raid into North Vietnam in March as the US launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a series of USAF and Vietnamese Air Force (VNAF) air raids against North Vietnam. President Johnson sent 3,500 US Marines to Vietnam with the sole mission of protecting our airbase at Da Nang. 3 weeks later, the VC bombed the US Embassy in Saigon, killing 2 and injuring more than 200 Americans and South Vietnamese. Within 2 days, LBJ made the Marines available for combat support for the first time. Regardless of what anybody said, we were in the war now, boots and all.